Alrighty, everyone, hello, and welcome back to yet another episode of my nonsense and mayhaps something of Belock's nonsense. Belock being my pigeon. Hi, Beobe. Oh, he mad because I'm sitting in a special chair. But now, nonetheless, guess what? In just a few short moments, we are going to witness March and all of the splendor that, especially in my area, comes with that, which is big fat St. Patrick's Day parades with all of the shamrocks and all of the green and all of the boozing and floozing that my people love to do. You know what I mean? It's always a great time on St. Patrick's Day, especially up here where there has historically been a large Irish diaspora and where the party gets pretty fucking solid, I'm not gonna lie. However, as we talk about St. Patrick's Day, you'll also notice a lot of folks insist on some interesting things about the saint for which this day is named after. Despite the fact that most people think of this as basically just, Irish Heritage Day in America and just a day of Irish patriotism in general, there are a lot of folks who maybe wonder a little something or other about some of the myths surrounding St. Patrick, especially this idea that he once drove all the snakes out of Ireland. This has been a massive point of conjecture on the witchy space for a long time, in which many neo-pagans, who in my opinion could probably sharpen their research skills a little more. Go around kind of just repeating this idea that St. Patrick drove out all the snakes, and that snake is some kind of euphemism or metaphor for pagans. And so St. Patrick, one of the three major patron saints of Ireland, has gone from, very, very interesting folk hero and symbol of Irish identity to yet another villain who is out there persecuting all the poor druids and this and that and up and down. And far be it for me to ignore the many cases in which, pagan folk across Europe absolutely did get their shit rumbled by many different kinds of saints. Far be it for me to, look down on that idea or say that people are not rightfully angry at the idea that we celebrate any kind of person who would do such a thing. However, what I will say is that we should all maybe pause and wonder if perhaps the things that we are spreading about this saint maybe are actually as factual as everyone repeating these claims makes them out to be. So we are going to talk a little bit about St. Patrick today, where these ideas come from, and who the man himself actually was and what he was actually doing in ye old Emerald Isle. Before we get into all that though, hello again, my name is Sara Rastres and I am a Christian witch, a content creator, a writer, and educator, and very specifically a writer of these two books right here, which are all about how Christian witch works and why Christian witch works as a title, as an identity, as a function, and all the fun you can have with that. If you want to know how we justify all this kind of stuff with the Bible and, how we, do our actual practice of witchcraft, book 1. If you want to know what kind of journey spiritually of growth and, wisdom you end up going on if you decide on this path, book 2. They're both very, very good, and you can get them from me, from Amazon, from anywhere else. But of course, if you don't want to go grab a book just yet, I understand. All you gotta do is ring that bell, subscribe, and like this video, because we do post all kinds of fun topics like this every single Friday. And I've also got a blog and all kinds of other stuff, tons and tons and tons of resources for you to check out and peruse if you decide that you just want to know a little bit more about things like tarot cards, about things like Bible verses, and everything else in between. And if you want to support the work that I do, please do head over to my Patreon, where if you become a member, you can get these videos and a lot of other stuff 2 weeks early and ad-free. Just saying. Anyway, St. Patrick. So, St. Patrick is an interesting fellow, namely because despite being a patron saint of Ireland, he was not Irish. And in fact, his actual name was probably something like, gotta read it because it's a lot, Magonus Sucatus Patricius, which, right, Patricius, or, whatever that word would become in a more Irishanization of it, some form of what we now call Patrick. It'd be something like this. And so, okay, cool. This was his name, and he was actually a Brythonic citizen, right? He was more of an English person who was a Roman citizen, because by this point, where he was from in the kind of Brythonic area over there had been part of the Roman Empire. But the Irish were still very much independently doing their own thing. They were pretty fairly isolated, and they were able to hold on to a lot about their culture for a very, very, very long time. Still, though, one thing that did happen fairly, you know, normally, and by normally I mean just like at a regular basis, was that Christian missionaries of the Roman Empire would try to go over there and either minister to whatever Christians were already there, or see if they could pick up a few other converts. So let's start there with just the fact that, like, St. Patrick was not the first or the only person to be running around on that Christian shtick out there. One person, actually, in fact, Palladius, was this dude who was also on the same kind of mission, but rather than going out to, like, you know, make massive converts or anything like that, or spread the mission hardcore, according to this source right here, it seemed like he was kind of more focused on what small groups of Christians were already in Ireland, and also, like, he just kind of, as a Roman citizen, didn't really have a lot of understanding of Irish society, social hierarchy or structure, values, ethics, or really anything about the Irish people, which would have put another very big cultural barrier in between any kind of ministry he would want to do, even if he was focused on that kind of thing. St. Patrick, therefore, in the kind of argument of this article, had a little bit more success because he was familiar with the Irish people and their customs, and he was familiar with that because at the age of around 16, he had actually been kidnapped from his family, who were, you know, some decent, I guess, like British Roman nobility of some kind, or at least decently well-off people. And so in this raid, many people were taken and they were sold into slavery in Ireland, and that is where St. Patrick spent a long 6 years just working under the oversight of the Irish people he was sold to. And in that time, he learned probably quite a bit about Ireland. So in this early time period, around the 400 CE, right, we've got this young boy who's sold into slavery and is kind of learning all these things. And what's interesting to know also at this time is that Christianity was to the Roman Empire kind of like it is to a lot of people in America now today, in that it's kind of just a cultural thing in the background, and it's something where people could say, yeah, I'm religious, yeah, I believe in God, but maybe not necessarily take it that seriously or care all that much about the actual observance or, you know, hard, stringent practice that the really zealous might get into. That matters a lot because when St. Patrick went into slavery, you know, when he was kidnapped like that, he kind of knew of God, but didn't really give much of a shit. And it was through that experience of that hardship that he started leaning harder and harder on God, and that he started realizing the extent of which he had kind of been neglecting any kind of faith practice at all, and really started to develop that kind of relationship with God, according to St. Patrick's own writings, right? Which we have, mind you. We have the direct writings of this man that everyone is talking about. We have them. We have his confession. We have his letter to this fucking asshole that we'll talk about later. We have all these kinds of things from the horse's mouth that we can look at to see, like, what was going on with this guy. And this is kind of what St. Patrick was saying about himself from his own fucking words. So, right, that's kind of, he gives a lot of credit to God in his confession about, you know, surviving that time and getting free and all these kinds of things, to the point that he goes back to his parents in these, you know, more Brythonic lands. And then he feels a call to go back to Ireland and to spread the mission. And here is where we get some interesting notes that might shed some light on the crazy things people like to say nowadays about St. Patrick. Of the many wild miracles attributed to St. Patrick, such as like him raising a giant from the dead just to baptize it and let it go back to being dead for the sake of entertaining his students, or, you know, driving the snakes out or whatever else, the one in his confession that is directly attributed to him from himself is the miracle of saving him and the company of Irish pagans who were kind of just getting back into the country. So when he kind of felt that call, that mission to go back to Ireland, he found a boat of Irishmen who eventually were willing to take him. You know, at first they were like, no, fuck off, go away. But then as he was leaving, they're like, oh, actually, never mind, we'll take you. Just come on and get in the boat and we'll go. And then they ended up kind of like out of food as they got off the boat later and tried to find their way back to civilization. One of these Irish pagan folk, they go look at St. Patrick, they say, okay, well, if your god is so fucking cool, can he like conjure us, I don't know, a fucking McDonald's burger or something? We are dying out here. We're not going to make it that much longer. There's no people around. So in St. Patrick, he says, well, what I need all of us to do right now, group huddle, we're going to pray really hard and we're going to turn our hearts to God and God will surely help us out. And then like, within the day, they stumbled upon a massive pile, just massive herd of pigs that they were able to kill and eat, and not only eat that day, but have food for like the next couple days thereafter, even enough to feed their dogs that were with them. They were on the brink of starvation, and they were saved that day by the grace of God. That is in St. Patrick's writings. So that's the kind of stuff St. Patrick was doing, and he was talking about. There is no mention of any kind of mistreatment of pagans or anything, and in fact, in chapter 48, he goes out of his way to say, I did everything I could to be kind and fair to these folks because, first of all, I didn't want anyone to have a reason to slander God. Second of all, because I didn't want either me or other Christians or the pagans to be persecuted, right? Like, he very explicitly says, like, no one can say I treated these people wrong because I did my damnedest to treat them nicely. And more than just with the pagans, I mean, it didn't matter what he was doing, even with other Irish Christians, who there were a small number at the time, they would try to pay him for his ministry, and he would give them their money back and say, nope, no thank you, sorry, I don't require payment for my works, right? Like, he was just someone who everyone found favor with. And this likely, honestly, not just because he's such a darling angel, probably had to do also with the social politics of Ireland at the time, which a lot of people don't know about. According to this article, we get a lot of really interesting, like, just fascinating insight into Irish culture at the time, into the importance of, like, oral history and all this kind of stuff. We also get an understanding of, like, how their legal system was set up, in which there is one high king and 5, like, provincial kings, or the tuatha, who are out here just kind of constantly fucking fighting with each other. These 5 provincial kings constantly fucking with each other all the fucking time. So going back to this source again, this kind of dovetails these two sources together, because then Bieler again, he's out here saying, yeah, by the way, those 5 provinces the other source was talking about, yeah, that caused problems for St. Patrick, right? He had to play nice with everybody. He had to constantly be currying favor with kings and with whoever else. And even he had to kind of play both sides sometimes, because the situation, the tension between these kings and their lands were so fucked all the time. All the time they'd be fighting each other. To the point that sometimes when a king did say, like, yeah, take, go on your merry way with, like, one of our lower nobility or one of our younger princes, they'll guard you on the road, that actually ended up making more problems, because other raiders from other domains would see them as more of a target because of the political feuding constantly going on between them. So St. Patrick had to do a lot of just, like, high-level fucking diplomacy all the time to try and make sure that he could just go about his business without getting caught in the middle of everyone else's nonsense. More than that, on top of that, that's just Ireland. Whereas now I have to talk about also the shit mess going on right across the pond over here, back in what is now like Scotland and England and all of them. Because the Roman Empire was up in there, and they were also paying, like, a lot of different kind of raider kings and other stuff to hold off the Anglo-Saxon tribes, all the Germanic tribes that were trying to come up and cause problems. One of those being Coroticus. Coroticus was a Brythonic, like a British kind of Roman high-level dude who, after kicking enough Germanic ass, decided that he was also going to maybe roughhouse a little bit with the Irish people, plunder their stuff, take some stuff from them, because he had the power to do that. And so one of Patrick's writings outside of Confessions is his letters to Coroticus, where he is very vehemently decrying this guy and saying, how could you do this to these innocent people? St. Patrick was constantly on the side of the people that he was with, even though he understood that he was not an Irish person himself, and in his writings, he longed for home, and he would really like to have gone back home. He stayed with the Irish people. He acknowledged their plight very often. He was good to those people as far as can be known, as far as we can know from his writings and the writings of his contemporaries around him at the time. And he was just doing his best. And even in his confessions, he says, you know what? If I get buried alongside these guys, that'd be good. If I have ever imitated good for the sake of my God whom I love, I ask that he grant me to be able to shed my blood with these converts and captives, even were I to lack a grave for burial, or my dead body were to be miserably torn apart limb from limb by dogs or wild beasts, or were the birds of heaven to devour it. I declare with certainty that if this were to happen, I would have gained both my soul and my body. There is no doubt whatever that we will rise on the appointed day in the brightness of the sun, that is, in the glory of Christ Jesus our Redeemer. We shall be like children of the living God and co-heirs of Christ, and to be fashioned in his image, since it is from him and through him and in him that we are to reign, right? That's kind of like one of those more ending parts where he's just kind of like, yeah, of course he's talking about the converts, because those are the main people he's rolling with. And some other sources, the Druids were really not a fan. Obviously, the Druids, who were kind of more like, less like priests and more like scholars and philosophers of Ireland, they were kind of like, this guy sucks, and this new religion he's bringing also sucks. Of course, naturally. But St. Patrick didn't go out of his way to antagonize these people, and he often like tried to do what he could for the people that were rocking with him. Obviously, he couldn't do everything for everybody because he's one man, but he really tried to advocate for the people that were with him and the people that like were you know, coming to him in whatever capacity. He was doing his damnedest. And what we know from his writings is that he was not a very like highly educated guy, right? He was not super you know, affluent or educated to the extent, right? Like his Latin wasn't great, and he points out some insecurity about his Latin as he's writing his confessions. These confessions also, namely, you could tell by the way they're written, that they're not to absolve him of anything from Irish pagans. They're to absolve him of stuff from the Christians. They were like, okay, what's your problem? Like, why are you so buddy? Like, work harder. And he was just like, no, I'm going to do what needs to be done for the sake of what needs to be done, so that nobody here, me, Christians, or pagans, are being persecuted because of that political situation, because of all this kind of stuff going on. He was playing, basically just walking a knife's edge of this political situation between both the pagan kings of Ireland and also the fucking Roman Empire right next door, and the church, and, you know, the common folk and the converts and everyone, and he was just trying his damnedest to hold it all together, right? That's the kind of sense we get from his writings, and also from, you know, the hymns and songs sung by folks like his student Secundius and these other people who were just like, yeah, dude's a fucking angel. Obviously, right? We all know that, like, this is his account, and sure, there are going to be people who say, well, that's just what he said. What about all this other stuff that, you know, that he did? And what I say to you is, okay, what's probably going to be more accurate about this man? The stuff that he said, or people around him said in the time period, or the shit that random ass historians 4 centuries later made up that don't have any historical basis? Because that's where a lot of this whole drove the snakes out of Ireland shit comes from. Is sources from like 4 centuries later, way after this man died in an unmarked grave, exactly like he said he wanted to happen in his fucking confessions. One of these historians was actually an Irish guy like Tirchan, or however this is pronounced in Irish, I'm sorry. But he was a bishop from like the 7th, 8th century who was just kind of like trying to scrap together any kinds of ideas. And as we've seen with other saints like Saint Valentine, when you're that far removed from the subject, a lot of folk myth gets wrapped into it, gets wrapped all up in there, and starts not making a lot of sense. So there's a lot of different interesting myths and legends about the miracles St. Patrick has done, the snakes being one, the giant being another. Others, right, there are other ideas about St. Patrick that have to do with more iconography, like, that we would recognize, like the shamrock, right? So it's said that St. Patrick used that 3-leaf clover to explain the mystery of the Trinity to the Irish pagans, where it's, you know, there's 3 leaves, but there's 1 plant, so too God is like 3 persons, 1 God, you know, that kind of thing. So that's where the shamrock kind of came from when we think of St. Patrick, because it's abundant in Ireland, and also because, like, you know, he allegedly used that to explain this kind of thing to pagans. Great. But this whole concept of like driving snakes out of a country that didn't really have snakes to begin with is kind of like, okay, I don't know where that came from, and I don't know why. where we might think it could have come from, once again requires us to look at the cultural fabric of Ireland. Going back over here to this source posits that because poetry and language and narrative-based argument were so important to the Celts, that first of all, they didn't write a lot of stuff down. A lot of their stuff was written in verse. It wasn't the kind of clunky, written down long rhetorical appeals that folks like St. Augustine or Cicero would have been using in these urban areas, these cities where, learned folk were coming around writing stuff down. The writing system that the Irish had was not awesome. It was the Ogham rooms, and this was complicated and, kind of not practical for everyday use. It was more for ceremonial stuff. And so these Irish folk who, for centuries, successfully resisted the kind of Europeanization of them, right? That kind of outer Romanization of them. They really maintained a lot of oral fixtures and oral storytellings. And so there are a lot of folk stories that tell certain morals, that tell certain myths and truths and legends that also end up having to do with St. Patrick a little bit, kind of almost in like a King Arthur way, where like, despite the fact that a lot of the stories being told are centuries separated from St. Patrick and when St. Patrick would have been alive, St. Patrick becomes a folk hero in a lot of oral Irish stories, because that way they could kind of legitimize their old folk stories to an increasingly Christian audience. St. Patrick became the cultural and narrative liaison as a folk hero between the old Celtic myths and the old Celtic lessons and the new Christian understanding of the world that was coming through. And with that, we realize that, what we have written down is certainly not the only stories that have ever been told. That from very early on, St. Patrick had become a pretty beloved folk figure to the Irish, and that he maintained his status as such by the will of the people who kept telling these stories and telling these narratives of morality and religion and all these other things that they were telling amongst themselves. It wasn't until the 1100s when King Henry II finally took over Ireland and successfully squashed any resistance that they would kind of begin to be more like the rest of Europe and, England and whatever the Roman Empire had imprinted on Europe by that point. That's when Ireland starts looking more like the rest of Europe in those civic, those educational, those kind of political, rhetorical situations. Until then, they had all this time to be Irish, to be just undiluted Irish, to hold those customs and cultural understandings close, to really grab onto their traditions of that oral storytelling, of poetry, bards, all this kind of stuff, who would just sing and tell these stories and poems and all this kind of stuff. And in that cultural fabric, we find these kinds of interesting folk representations that are not by any means historically accurate, necessarily, but serve a purpose like any parable, like any of our favorite folk tales tell us. Right? No one's out here going around saying that Little Red Riding Hood or Three Little Pigs is historically fucking accurate, but they still serve a purpose rhetorically. They still serve a purpose to explain certain morals and arguments of how we should act and be. That's folklore 101. So when we think of St. Patrick, the actual historical saint, and St. Patrick, the folk hero doing crazy shit, we gotta understand there's a bit of a divide here. And all of this nonsense about how St. Patrick was actually a terrible, bad person is kind of silly. It's especially silly because we have any evidence at all from the time period that comes not only from this man, but from the people around him, that we also know that there were seriously tense political situations happening, and that St. Patrick had to defend himself from Christians a lot because of his choices, especially because of his choice to de facto excommunicate that Coroticus asshole we were talking about earlier. He did that because Coroticus was raiding and pillaging and doing terrible things to the Irish people. And St. Patrick could only be responsible for the people that were directly under his stewardship, which were the converts. Half the time, he had to go fucking play games between the 5 kings of the area themselves. So, he had to go play diplomacy with them. How much was he reasonably supposed to be able to do? He wasn't a warrior by any means. He wasn't really anything other than just a dude on a mission. just trying his best. So this concept that he killed pagans is, first of all, an extrapolation of what snakes might even mean. Maybe snakes references pagans because, right, in the 7th, 8th, 9th century, this was often used, the snake, the dragon, as a representation of evil. Maybe, but not necessarily. We don't have a lot of evidence that that's exactly what that meant, and even if it did, we don't have evidence that that's anything other than just like some folk shit people made up. What we do have now, definitively, is a saint who not only represents, you know, whatever he represents officially in the Catholic Church, but specifically a saint that represents kind of the spirit of Ireland, and especially the Irish diaspora. Between St. Patrick and St. Bridget and, other notable saints of Ireland, it's the Irish Christianity that arose, the Irish Celtic Christianity, as it's called, has its own special flavor, its own uniqueness, its own intrigue to it that is special to Irish people. And now especially, we see that in the past 100, maybe 200 years or so, St. Patrick's Day has really also become a heavily national celebration as much as it does some kind of religious Catholic celebration. It is a celebration of Irishness. It is when everyone, right, as one film likes to say, right, St. Patrick's, everyone's Irish today, is when everyone can join in that fun, right? In the green and the shamrock and all the kind of stuff, and just have a good time and just get together and celebrate. And especially in my area, right, near that kind of New England area where there's a lot of Irish diaspora, that's important. That's important for people to have. It's just like 2 days later, another festival that's really important for the diaspora of my area is St. Joseph's Day. Literally 2 days after St. Patrick's, and that's for the Italians. That's a big Italian festival where we get out our zeppole and all this kind of shit. So it's just a day to celebrate being Irish at this point, and that's fine, and that's okay. And like, that's all it really needs to be at this point, especially if people aren't religious in the first place. But in terms of religious custom, there is actually some really, really fun idea. This called drowning of the shamrock that I just want to throw in here just because it's interesting. But basically, according to this source, which talks a lot about, St. Patrick's Day also as like a more national situation and more like a, just a general public bonding moment. There's this concept called drowning the shamrock, which is when, once upon a time, people didn't wear shamrocks on them for St. Patrick's Day. They would wear crosses or have crosses because it's St. Patrick. It still is a Catholic saint, right? So it was a more religious thing. But some folks, maybe they couldn't afford crosses or whatever. They could afford to go into any random-ass field and find that shamrock that is so closely attached to St. Patrick and pin it on their hat or just carry it around. So it started as more of like a quote-unquote vulgar practice. Some English folk, of course, really didn't like it, but, fuck them. So some folk really didn't like it. They thought it was kind of crude and whatever, but eventually more and more people started doing that. Everyone started having a little shamrock. And another thing people didn't like, again, this is a drinking-ass holiday. Everyone gets drunk all the time. I could tell you the first thing people think of when they think of St. Patrick's up here is getting schmammed. But like, even back then, the concept of drowning the shamrock meant you would put the shamrock in your cup of beer, and then you would drink the whole cup of beer, and then you'd fish the shamrock out. And this was kind of just like a tradition, a custom. And you wouldn't just throw it out, you'd throw it over your left shoulder, excuse me. So you'd throw it over your left shoulder. And to me, right away, as someone who's interested in folk magic, this reminds me just like how, when you spill salt, you throw it over your left shoulder so you don't get bad luck. So this is kind of a similar thing with that lucky shamrock. You throw it over your shoulder, and to me that seems like perhaps some way of dispelling bad luck or even gaining good luck maybe, but just some kind of little apotropaic, like, anti-bad luck thing that you would do. The thing that people didn't like about it, I guess according to this source that some people complain about, is that some folks would have like 4 beers before they got to their last beer of the day where they'd put the fucking shamrock in, so they would just get really schmammed, like super sloppy drunk. And so, of course, some people were like, that is not appropriate behavior of the devout because they're boring and fuck you. But you know what I mean. That's just kind of one of those interesting little facts about the shamrock and a little tidbit of folk magic you could take with you on that day that's very interesting to me. But all in all, I mean, if we look at the actual historically attested, straight from the horse's mouth history of St. Patrick, the concept that he killed pagans is ridiculous. Just on the virtue of the fact that dude was scared to fucking fart wrong by his accounts because everything was going crazy all the time at all fronts on all angles. And so all he wanted to do was do his ministry and not give anyone a reason to discredit his ministry. He wanted to walk the walk as much as talk the talk. Especially, and he notes that because by doing that, he would win people over. He knew that he would win people over, if not by the stuff he was saying, then by the way he lived by those virtues. And I mean, obviously, right? If people don't trust what you're saying, then if they see you doing what you say you're going to do, they'll trust you a little bit more, right? Everything, of course, has some layer of motive behind it. St. Patrick isn't doing everything out of the pure, sparkling goodness of his heart. Some of them are just simply politically and diplomatically intelligent moves that intelligent people would make. But that still goes to show that, like, he was conscious enough of how his actions would be perceived that the concept of him even fucking hurting someone, never mind killing them, is absolutely insane. So maybe that could put us all to rest a little bit. We can all figure out that actually, no, this guy, he's pretty cool. And whatever you're celebrating St. Patrick's Day for, be it a national holiday, be it a religious observance for the saint himself, it's all in good fun. And it's all just a moment where, as far as I've ever seen, as someone who is not Irish at all, the Irish themselves, the diaspora here, even in Ireland, are very happy to open up their arms and let everyone celebrate with them. So do with that what you will. If you are of Irish descent, freely enjoy your day. Maybe do a little drowning of the shamrock, if you will, however you'd like. And I will see you next time for some more good chats. See ya!